join the class, so I'm going to get that recording started. So to pick up where we left off, first category of evidence for evolution was fossils. And then the second category was all about body parts, the homologous structures, the analogous structures, the vestigial structures. So let's review those. Oh, I found this new image too, showing the potential appearance of the ancestors of whales. So these kinds of primitive whales, we have found fossils like these guys, these ones that are kind of half and half, maybe more like a seal. We've found fossils of them. I don't know about these other ones, but here we're suggesting that there was some kind of predatory mammal that was getting some of its food from the seashore. And the more successful ones started swimming out into the water, and then the more successful ones didn't even go back to land very much until finally they never went back to land. At any rate, we talked about the blind cave fish and the other creatures that live in caves that are blind. So here's a little summary or a review of the different anatomical evidence. Anatomy refers to body parts, right? So, first of all, homologous structures easily confused with analogous structures. If it's homologous, that means they're similar. Analogous means they're analogies. So they're kind of alike, but not really. We're just making a comparison between them. So look at this. The homologous have the same basic design. In other words, they're the same on the inside that must have come from a common ancestor. If they're the same design, we had to inherit that from a common ancestor in our DNA. And this shows we're related. But on the outside, they've been modified so they fit their own environment. And this is showing a change. So they're the same inside, different outside. That's homologous. Analogous is the opposite. They look alike on the outside, but they're built completely differently on the inside. So homologous and analogous in a way are the opposite. The same inside, but different outside. Different inside, but the same on the outside. Now, why would they look alike on the outside? Well, because they're used the same way in a similar environment. But they're built completely differently because they were inherited from a different ancestor. So this one is not showing that they're related, but it is showing that there's a change over time. Similarly, the third type of anatomical evidence, vestigial structures, the ones that are shrunken and useless, they're left over from a previous ancestor that used to use them. We inherited this body part, but since we stopped using it, it has mutated, but that mutation didn't hurt because we didn't need that body part anymore. So it's showing a change, right? It's showing that that body part has changed compared to when the ancestor actually used it in the past. So that's the three types of anatomical evidence we did last time. We also talked about embryology, how we can look at a common pattern of development that we've all inherited from a common ancestor. We've inherited this same approach to growing a body, from starting as a zygote, a single fertilized egg, and then becoming an embryo and a fetus. We have the same pattern, which suggests that we inherited that from the same ancestor. So we looked at this series of diagrams, right, where we saw that the human was pretty hard to tell from a monkey, and was even hard to tell from a pig or even a chicken at certain stages of development. And this is kind of crazy too. Remember, we talked about at this stage, we can see the spine, we can see the eye, right? But look at the spine comes all the way down to a tail. When you were an embryo, you grew a tail. But then our DNA that's unique to humans basically said, wait a minute, you don't need a tail. And all the cells in the tail were reabsorbed. Similarly, you started to grow gills. Here it is labeled the gill slit. Our throats started to fold inward because fish were our ancestors as well. And so we started to grow gills. We inherited the DNA to begin growing gills, but then more modern DNA took over and stopped us from developing gills completely. Pretty crazy. Okay, so that's where we left off, and this is where we want to pick up. So Darwin knew about embryology. He knew about vestigial structures, analogous structures, homologous structures. He knew about fossils, although we have a lot more fossils now than he knew about. And in particular, we have more fossils that show the transition between apes and humans. But he didn't know about biochemistry the way we know about it now, the molecules that make up living things. So, since his time, since Darwin suggested the theory of evolution by natural selection, people have been testing it out whenever they get new information. So when they found out about Mendel's laws of genetics, they used that to see if it fit with the theory of evolution. And not only did it fit, it actually kind of explained how these changes could occur by changes in the genes. It explained how we could inherit traits from our ancestors. Well, even since that time, we found even stronger evidence because we now are able to look at the molecules in different creatures. And we're finding very similar molecules in different organisms. So that becomes pretty strong evidence because there's only one place that your molecules come from, and that is your DNA. And how do we get our DNA? We inherit it from our ancestors. So if different organisms are using the same molecule or very similar molecules, they must have inherited that molecule from their ancestor. And if we inherited the same molecule, then doesn't that say that we must be related? But usually the molecule is somewhat modified, which is showing that it's continuing to change. So we're using the same molecule for the same purpose, which says we got it from a common ancestor. But we can see slight differences in these molecules, showing that we continue to evolve, we continue to change. And we'll look at a few examples. One, of course, is DNA. We can see how similar our DNA is to other creatures. Another would be the molecule that carries oxygen in our blood. It's called hemoglobin. Another is the molecule that controls our blood sugar. You've probably heard of it, insulin. And I'm going to move on. And once again, if you didn't fill in all the blanks, you can find this PowerPoint in the class materials. Just go to Files at the top of the page, then open the folder that says Class Materials, then open the folder that says Evolution, and then you can open this Evidence for Evolution PowerPoint. Okay, so there is a process called DNA hybridization. And maybe you remember the word hybrid means a mix. We called organisms that have one dominant and one recessive genes, we called those hybrids. A car that uses some gasoline but also uses an electric motor is a hybrid car. Here we're making hybrid DNA, which means we're mixing DNA from different creatures. No, we are not raising a whole organism with DNA from two different creatures. We are not making, I don't know, half bird, half lizards. We're not making Batman. We are not combining these DNAs and growing a whole creature out of it. All we're doing is seeing how closely the DNA connects. the more closely it is able to connect, in other words, the better that the bases pair up, like the A with the T, the G with the C, all of that, the more closely they're pairing up, that says that we have more of the same genes. And so we can measure how well that they pair up. If they pair up really well, then we know that they're closely related. So humans basically have 100% of the same DNA as another human because we have all the same genes on the same chromosomes, on the same locations on those chromosomes. We might have different versions of the genes, but we do have all the same genes in the same places. So we would predict that closely related organisms have DNA that's more similar than a distantly related organism. And so we can test this prediction, like I said, by mixing the DNA together. We want to see how well it fits. And what we're trying to do is splice the DNA together. So we take the double helix and we unzip it. So we have a left side and we have a right side. And maybe we do that with dog DNA, and then we also do it with wolf DNA, and then we take the one side, the left side from the dog DNA, and see how well it matches the right side from the wolf DNA. That is such a close match that we consider dogs to be the same species as wolves. They can have little dog-wolf hybrid puppies, right? But in the test tube, we can mix their DNA and see that it's a perfect fit. Then if we try this with coyotes and dogs or coyotes and wolves, we find that it's not as good of a fit. Most of it fits because they're both in the canine family, but there are more gaps that did not zip back together between the coyote and the wolf than there was between the dog and the wolf. We can do it again with a fox, and it fits even less well. There's even more gaps between a fox and a wolf DNA than there was between coyote wolf DNA. So that's what we mean by hybrid DNA. We're mixing the DNA together in a test tube. We're not even trying to grow it into an organism. It wouldn't grow into an organism. We're just trying to see, well, will this zipper of DNA fit that zipper of DNA? If you think of the DNA as a zipper where you can unzip it to copy it and stuff, just like we talked about before we left the building. So that's DNA hybridization. So let's see the results when we look at doing these experiments with humans. Here's our results. We find out that humans and chimpanzees have 97.6% of the same DNA. It's just that 2.4% that changes a chimp into a human. I find that pretty incredible. We're so closely related to those guys. Almost all of our DNA is the same. Just that little 2.5% is enough to turn this into that. That's pretty incredible that so much of our DNA is alike. And this is exactly what was being predicted by Darwin before they knew about DNA, just by looking at the anatomy of the way the chimp was built, the way its skull was, the way its hands were, the way its heart was, the way its body is built is the closest animal that there is to a human. And then we confirmed it by testing their DNA. Now we can go more and more distant relatives as well. Here's another ape called a gibbon. And one thing I'll just point out real quickly, apes, like humans, have no tails. Monkeys do have tails. So this is another ape. Since it has no tail, you might guess that it's probably more closely related to a human than a monkey is to a human, right? Well, it turns out the gibbon isn't quite as close as the chimp. And then when we go to the monkeys, they're even more distant than the human was. But still, this little monkey right here, 90% of the DNA in that guy is the same as you and me. It must be the 10% that makes us different, huh? That has us standing up on two legs, that lost our fur, that allowed our brain to grow so much bigger and modified our vocal cords so that we could have language. Just that 10% does that. Well, what about this other 90%? What's it doing? Well, it's growing hands and feet and knees and elbows and hearts and livers and lungs. All those different body parts are quite similar between all of us. Now here's another monkey, a South American one, which is even more distantly related. It's not as close of a relative. And I think that's interesting because notice that these guys are African. So is the chimp. The gibbon is Asian. But as you know, you could technically walk from Africa to Asia, but you would have to swim to get to South America today, huh? Well, what this is suggesting is we are more closely related to the apes of Africa and the monkeys of Africa than to the monkeys of South America. There are no apes in South America, only monkeys. What we think happened long ago, way before humans were here, when Pangea broke apart, South America and Africa were once connected, and there were monkeys that lived there on all over from South America to Africa, but they were connected together. But then when it broke apart, they started evolving in different directions. So the South American monkeys evolved to fit in their environment. And one thing they evolved that the African monkeys didn't was a tail that could be used as a fifth hand. They can pick up things with this tail. They can hang from this tail like a fifth hand. African monkeys cannot do that. The tail is only for balance. But some of those African monkeys then evolved into apes. And some of those apes then evolved into humans. And where do we find all of the ancient fossils of pre-human ape missing links? They're all in Africa. Some in Asia too. But the oldest ones are all African. Here's another primate called a galago. It is more primitive than a monkey, and it only has 58% of the same DNA as we do. So the less closely related you are, the less your DNA matches. And that's what we mean by DNA hybridization. Okay, here's some other examples of biochemical similarities between creatures. So I mentioned insulin. We use it to regulate blood sugar, and we're not the only ones that use insulin. Most mammals use insulin. And pig insulin is close enough to humans that diabetics can use that pig insulin to control their own blood sugar. Pretty similar molecule that we both had to inherit from our ancestors. And if it's the same molecule, that suggests that we are related to pigs. Well, we're both mammals. We're both warm-blooded. All of those things have hair, feed milk to our young, etc. Here's another one. Many mammals use this molecule hemoglobin to carry oxygen. And if we look at the efficiency of the hemoglobin, the most efficient is in the whales, which makes sense because if it's holding oxygen, isn't that something a whale would really need to have, is the ability to have efficient storage of oxygen? So the whale is using the same molecule that we use, but it's been modified to become more efficient because they need it for their lifestyle. So it shows that we're related, we're both mammals, but it also shows that we've changed because they need that efficient hemoglobin. And here's another one. So, no longer in mammals. This is a simple creature, kind of related to a snail. Imagine a snail that lives in the ocean, but it does not have a shell. This is a sea slug. And sea slugs vary in size, basically from the size of your little finger up to the size of a football, depending on what type we're studying. And there have been some studies done with some of the bigger ones, football-sized sea slugs, and they've put them in aquariums. And the thing with these sea slugs is that their brains are so simple. There's only like a couple of hundred cells in their brains, unlike the billion cells in your brain. And they're so simple that we know exactly which cell is connected to which cell in the brain, and we know what molecules that they're using to control their behavior. And when sea slugs are taught a task, we can measure the changes in that molecule, just like we can measure the changes in that molecule when humans learn something. And it's the same molecule, even in a sea slug, as it is in a human, that changes when we learn something new. Now, just in case you're wondering what it is that a sea slug could possibly learn, it's not like they're memorizing Shakespeare or something. But these experiments, basically, if you have a sea slug in an aquarium and you turn on a light, it doesn't do anything. On the other hand, if you have a sea slug in an aquarium and you give it just a little jolt of electricity, the sea slug is going to flinch. It's going to jump. It doesn't really like that little shock, right? Then, if you turn on the light at the same time that you give it the little shock, it's going to jump because it got shocked, right? And you do that 3 times, 6 times, 10 times, turn on the light at the same time that you shock it, right? Then you turn on the light, but don't give it a shock. Now, the sea slug normally doesn't react to the light going on, but the one that you shocked when the light came on learns that that's a signal, and it will flinch as if it got shocked just by turning the light on. It learned to associate the light with the shock. So it's learning a very simple thing, that light means pain, basically, and so it flinches when the light comes on. And then we can look at the molecules in its brain and we see that those are the same ones that change as when people learn a new task, whatever that new task might be. So what does this say? It says that the sea slug and humans inherited that same molecule from a distant common ancestor and use it in the same way still today. The same thing here with this hemoglobin that carries oxygen. The whale and humans and other mammals all inherited the ability to make this molecule and use it to carry oxygen from a distant ancestor, but it was modified, especially in the whale that needed the efficient version. The pig and the human and many other mammals all inherited the same molecule from an ancestor that was the first one to form that molecule, passed it on in its DNA to us and to the pig, showing that we're related. Oh, here's some pictures of the sea slug. Yeah. So this is its head up here. Right here, there's its eye. These are its gills along its back. So it's a very simple animal, about, like I said, the size of a football. Okay. So next, some people often ask, well, if evolution is true, why isn't it happening now? But no one ever said it wasn't. However, it does happen slowly in large creatures because we reproduce slowly. So there hasn't been enough time to see large creatures evolve. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. Especially we can observe it in smaller creatures that reproduce more quickly than we do. So we've seen lizards on Caribbean islands change since we've been observing them. We've seen moths in England change. I think even Darwin knew about that one. We've seen bacteria evolve in hospitals in a frightening way. Another one that I am aware of is that we have seen some small fish in Central America change. We've seen some birds on the Galapagos Islands change surprisingly rapidly when they're challenged by like a drought. They have evolved to survive with less water pretty quickly. So we have seen creatures changing over time. we have observed evolution. Let's look at some of these examples more closely. So the first one is about the moth, and it has this fancy name of industrial melanism. Industrial refers to industries. Maybe you remember from history, there was a time period where we first started having factories, and they call it the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so that's referring to the time of the Industrial Revolution and the influence of the factory on the environment. Melanism, I'm not sure if we talked about this molecule in our skin that gives our skin its color, melanin. And the cells that make melanin, if they become cancerous, we call that melanoma, a very dangerous form of skin cancer. But humans are not the only ones that make this molecule, melanin. We're going to talk about moths that make melanin to make their wings and their bodies darker. But wait a minute, this whole phrase is referring to how the amount of darkness, the melanism of the moth, changed because of the Industrial Revolution. Wait a minute, doesn't change mean evolve? So we're going to look at an example of how the factories changed the environment, and that caused the moth to evolve to become darker, to produce more melanin. So here's the story. Here's the story. Here's the story. There it is. So this is a well-known example. This happened in England during the Industrial Revolution. And it focuses on this animal called the peppered moth. Peppered because it has, its wings are mostly light colored, but it has these little black spots all over it as if it's covered with pepper. So the original peppered moth population was mostly light colored, and this helped them with camouflage against the tree bark where they rested during the day, because birds like to eat these moths if they can see them. So it was an advantage for them to be light colored because the tree bark was light colored also, and that way the birds would not see them. Well then, with the Industrial Revolution, if you think about a factory in the 1800s, they were not really using any smog controls. So all kinds of smoke and soot was released from their chimneys, and there was so much released that it covered the bark of the trees with soot. And what was once a light-colored tree is now a dark-colored tree. The bark of the tree was darkened because the soot was sticking to it. I know, it's disgusting. In fact, it was so bad that there were times where they called them killer fogs, where in England, hundreds and thousands of people would die from the smog that was being produced, especially if the weather was trapping that smog in one small area and it was becoming very, very thick smoke. So now this isn't happening so much because we have pollution controls, right? But at that time they didn't, and the trees got all covered with soot. But think about the moths that used to rest on the trees. Well, they're going to still go fly up to the tree and rest on that tree, but now the birds can find them easily. The light-colored moth sticks out against the dark background. So the birds ate the light-colored moths. Well, there'd always been a few that were darker than others because we have variation in traits, right? Remember how we have variation in traits as one of the basic steps of natural selection? But now those darker ones are the ones that are better camouflaged. Since they're better adapted to the new environment, their offspring survive and reproduce. And then most of the moths ended up being dark. The light-colored ones got eaten. That left the dark-colored ones to reproduce. They passed on that trait of being dark, and that trait took over the whole population. So the species had changed. In other words, the species had evolved from light-colored to dark-colored. So this is a really good example of evolution changing a species, but notice it's not forming a whole new species. It is only leading to a change in their most common trait, from being light colored was the most common trait to being dark colored was the most common trait. So it's what we call microevolution. It's evolution on a small scale. We might imagine that if there was one area where there was lots of factories darkening the bark of trees, and another area, maybe, I don't know, 500 miles away, where the moth also lived, but there were no factories. And so then we have some light colored moths in one area and dark colored moths in another area. And then if that continued where they were looking different from one another like that, and that continued for another, I don't know, 100 generations, maybe they would change enough that they would no longer be in the same species. But at this point, it's just microevolution. If they change enough to not be in the same species, that's what we call macroevolution. Evolution on a large scale, macro. Okay, so here's some pictures. Here's the original. Here you can see the dark colored one pretty well, huh? Light colored one's hard to find. It's up here. Not great photos, I have to say. And here we have the change population on the dark bark. Here's the light one, easy to find. The dark moth is over here. Much better camouflaged. If a bird is just going to fly up and grab one of these guys real quick, which one are they going to grab? So the best trait had shifted because of an environmental change. Okay, closer to home. This is in California and Nevada. There is a type of small fish called a pupfish. So these pupfish, they're called that, by the way, because the males kind of battle with one another and they look like puppies playing with each other, but it's the males actually fighting for mates. So during the ice ages, long time ago, 100,000 to 10,000 years ago, Death Valley and some other valleys on the border between Nevada and California were filled with water. As the glaciers melted, the water ended up filling these valleys. And the ancient lake in Death Valley was called Lake Manly. And there was a small fish living there. We can still find its fossils in Death Valley, but now the lake has dried up. But we find the fossils of this fish. Well, as this lake dried up, when the climate was changing at the end of the ice ages, as the lake dried up, it wouldn't dry up evenly. Some places would still have some ponds and pools. Some had springs that kept the water flowing up from the ground. Some had creeks going by. And so any fish that were in Lake Manly would either end up dying as the lake dried up, or they'd end up retreating into these little small ponds and pools and creeks. But the thing is, these ponds and pools are not connected with one another today. They're separate. They've been separated from one another for about 10,000 years. And each one of those little bodies of water had slightly different conditions. And at this point, the survivors have evolved differently. So they're all separated. They're isolated from one another. And just because this one evolved blue color on its fins, let's say, in pond letter A, well, in pond letter B, maybe they didn't evolve a blue color, maybe they evolved an orange color. Or maybe they evolved big fins in one pool and not in another. So they ended up, what we call it adaptive radiation, where they adapt to their own environment. They go through adaptation. They develop an adaptation, but in different directions. They radiate out in different directions. So each population of pupfish evolved to fit its own conditions. And today we have multiple species of pupfish. They each have unique traits adapted to their own environment. Most of them are named for the water that they live in. Like there's the Salt Creek pupfish. There's the Devil's Hole pupfish, which is a deep spring system in Nevada. There are probably about, I'm guessing, 10 different species of pupfish, all living in different waterways. So we can see that their bodies are all very similar to each other, and they're also very similar to this little fish fossil that we've found. But they're each unique in their own way. And so each of their habitats today is actually protected because that pupfish lives nowhere else in the world. So the Devil's Hole pupfish is protected as an endangered species. So is the Salt Creek pupfish. And here's a map showing the ancient lakes. So the California-Nevada line goes basically down through here. The green line is Death Valley National Park, which is mostly in California, but also partly in Nevada. Beatty is in Nevada. And so the state line comes through here somewhere. So these are the ancient lakes that were out there in what today is desert. Here's some of the pupfish. The one that you can see in Death Valley is the Salt Creek pupfish, and you can watch these guys chase each other around while they compete for females. Females tend to be more camouflaged. Here's the one that lives in what they call Devil's Hole. Here's another one, the Carbonera. So you can see they're pretty similar to one another, but they have changed to fit their own environment. Evolution happening now. Okay, our next example of evolution happening today is pretty scary, actually. It's called antibiotic resistance. So, as you may know, antibiotics are medicines that we take to kill bacteria. They do not work against viruses, so they wouldn't help us with corona. They only kill bacteria, antibiotics. And the name says it all. The medicine that kills bacteria, well, now they're resistant to it. They resist it. They're no longer killed by it. So originally, when we first discovered these, like in the 1950s, the original population of bacteria was easily killed off by penicillin in particular, is the most famous antibiotic. The original population of bacteria easily killed by it. But think about that. Were all of the bacterial cells killed by it? Probably not. Who's left to reproduce after exposure to the penicillin? The ones that were resistant to it. So which ones pass their genes on to the future bacteria? The ones that aren't killed by penicillin. The bacteria have evolved to resist our medicines. So if a person took penicillin, for example, and it killed 99% of the bacteria that they were infected with, but the 1% that survived had a gene that protected them from the antibiotic, what's left to reproduce? That 1%, right? And so that is what we mean by antibiotic resistance. They resist being killed by the medicine, by the antibiotic. And this is a problem for treating people in particular with tuberculosis today. There are strains of tuberculosis that we don't have a good way to control the infection anymore because the bacteria resist the antibiotic medication. Here's a diagram kind of showing this in a visual way. So to start with, we have a colony of bacteria that are genetically diverse. Notice most of them are blue, but some of them are red. The red indicates that they're not killed by the antibiotic. Then When we give the antibiotic to these bacteria, all the blue ones are dead, huh? Only the red ones survived. So in the future, when these red ones reproduce, what do we have here? The immune bacteria, the ones that are resistant, are the survivors. And that means we need to find a new medication to be able to fight off this infection anymore, because they've evolved a new trait. Notice the trait was actually there all along, wasn't it? It's just it wasn't important back in this time, but it was once they got exposed to the antibiotic. It became an important trait to have. It became an advantage. It was now considered an adaptation, and it spread through the new population. Okay. Then I mentioned this some time ago about artificial selection. So natural selection is when nature chooses which organisms survive and reproduce. Artificial selection is when people choose which organisms survive and reproduce. And actually, this is another piece of evidence for evolution, because basically we've taken control of the evolution of those creatures and we have changed them into something new. We've changed them into something that was not seen in nature. We've modified those creatures, and if we're changing them, they're evolving. So Darwin did know about artificial selection and talked about it quite a bit in his book. So, people have domesticated many species of plants and animals. In other words, their ancestors were wild, but now they're tame. We have domesticated them. When we domesticated them, we chose which organisms survive and reproduce. We acted just like natural selection, except it was humans making the choice. So we call it artificial selection. We made the choice. We selected which creatures were going to survive, which ones were going to reproduce. And our choices resulted in a change in the wild species into new forms, like the Chihuahua, like corn, like dairy cattle, like roses are quite different than the wild roses. We have wild roses here at Tahoe, and you might not even recognize them as roses when you first see them. At any rate, our choices changed these creatures. In other words, we caused them to evolve new traits, new features. And that would be a piece of evidence that species can change over time. That's the point there. We're demonstrating that species can be changed. Here's some examples. Here is the wild ancestor of cattle today. And these guys were huge. A person might only stand like this tall. But we were able to capture these and raise the ones that were the most gentle, the most docile, and keep them growing under our control. You can see how big their horns were in the past compared to what they are now. So this guy evolved into that because we made these choices of the traits that we wanted. We wanted them to be less aggressive, and we wanted them to produce a lot of milk, or the ones that we eat for steak and burgers, we want them to produce a lot of muscle really fast. Let's see, I think next we might have the wolf, which we chose. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not doing the wolf. We are doing corn. So this is the wild ancestor of modern corn called teosinte. It grows in Mexico and Central America. And if you were eating this stuff and starting to plant it, wouldn't you tend to plant the ones that have the most seeds packed together and the ones with the biggest seeds? And you keep doing that over 5,000 years, as people have been doing, and we end up with modern corn, where we have these big juicy seeds. And then we can go from a wolf to a Chihuahua. You know, Chihuahuas still think that they're wolves. They act like it, right? Claiming their territory. They do all the things that a wolf would do. They eat meat, although I don't really think a Chihuahua would survive in the wild. Right. That is the end. So what do you need to do? You need to submit your notes for points, okay? Oh, okay, Nataline. Don't worry about it. Nor, if we were in the classroom, I would say yes, you should take the notes on the artificial selection part. But yeah, what happened was that I had these notes for some time, and I didn't have artificial selection as part of it. And then I actually read Darwin's book. I read The Origin of Species from cover to cover, and I noticed how much time he spent talking about artificial selection and how important it was to his argument that species could change. And that's when I decided to add it on to the end of this PowerPoint, but I guess I still haven't put it into the note-taking part yet, right? So let's not worry about it. It's a different situation that we're in today. I'm just glad that you are here and participating and continuing learning. And I'll be happy to give you points if you submit those notes to me on Teams. And that's all I have for you today. So thanks for being here. Let me see. Can I talk to Evelyn for a minute? The rest of you guys are free to go. But Evelyn, I need to have a conversation with you. Well, I don't need to, but it'd be great to, okay? So the rest of you guys are welcome to check out. Thanks for being here. Evelyn, are you able to talk to me?
Yes.
Excellent. How are you, girl?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm kind of losing my voice from talking at you like this for an hour, though. Hey, so, did you get my most recent email?
Yes.
Okay, I'm looking here at, this is where I write down, you can't see it, can you? I write down all your scores, so that's what I'm looking at. So you turned in some of the recent stuff and I gave you points for those, but are you clear on the idea that to really get points, you need to turn in some of the old stuff?
Yes.
Yeah, so that stuff is really valuable, and I would love to see you do that. What do I have here? 8.2 questions. Do you have a copy of that part of the book, or should I send you photos of it?
Could you send me photos of it?
Absolutely. What about replication notes?
I think I might have those.
Okay, look for those, and if you can't find them, then just send me an email. I'll send you the blank notes, and then you can find the PowerPoint that they came from in Teams.
Okay.
Now, those notes also have like a vocabulary matching on the back
Mm-hmm.
that you're supposed to do to get full credit, okay?
Okay.
It's kind of like notes on the front and worksheet on the back, if that makes sense. And if you have trouble with anything, you know how to reach me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What else? Um, Mitosis internet lesson. Do you need that worksheet?
Yeah.
It might be on Teams, so look there first. It's called Mitosis internet lesson.
Okay.
And then there's one called Should This Dog Be Called Spot? It's actually a really easy worksheet.
I think I have that one.
Okay, great. Just finish it. And for all of these, when you finish them, just upload them to Teams.
Okay.
And then I look through those assignments and try to find them when people put something new in there. In fact, I saw some of your stuff, I think, already in there, huh?
Mm-hmm.
And then punnet number 2. Did you get my note that you did one side but not the other?
Yes.
Okay, so if you do the other side, you can double your score, basically.
Okay.
And if you have any trouble with that, let me know. I think, yeah, I saw that when you submitted it, the entire worksheet was already there. Both pages were there. So you did one side, but you need to do the other.
Okay.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
So is that going to keep you busy over the weekend?
Yes, it will.
Okay. And then here's my plan. Your percentage is a bit lower than I'd like it to be. I'm
Mm-hmm.
a little afraid that when we do these worksheets, we might need to figure something else out to do because I saw that your DNA test was kind of a low score. And,
Yeah.
and normally I say, okay, you can come in and correct your mistakes, right?
Yes.
But that's not going to happen, is it? So what I'm thinking is maybe we'll do like we are right now, having a conversation. I might just ask you some questions about DNA to make up some of those points, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But let's do the homework stuff first and see if that's enough to get you into the passing range. And then if we need to, we can look at like doing a retake of that test, basically, except it would be an oral exam.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks for sticking around.
Thank you,
You've been
Fairlane.
practicing?
Yes, I have.
Good for you. I have not been practicing enough. I need to get back to it. Actually, Holman sent me 2 songs that he wanted me to play along with, so that's been kind of fun.
Yeah.
All right.
I
Well, you
think.
take care. I'll see you later.
See ya.